Antes de iniciar con esta actividad, les informamos que se encuentran señalizadas las salidas de este auditorio y en caso de emergencia, les solicitamos respetar dichas indicaciones y evacuar por las zonas más cercanas a sus asientos. De igual manera, les solicitamos apagar sus celulares o configurarlos en modo silencio. Además, les recordamos que a la entrada están los aparatos de traducción simultánea, por si gustan tener uno de ellos, puedan retirarlos en la entrada. La Benemérita Universidad de Costa Rica les da la más cordial bienvenida a la conferencia La Invención de las Mujeres, 3 décadas de reflexiones y perspectivas en género, colonialismo y decolonialidad, por la profesora Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí, académica feminista nigeriana y profesora asociada de sociología de la Universidad de Stony Brook. Esta actividad se enmarca en la reciente inauguración de la Unidad de Equidad e Igualdad de Género de la Universidad de Costa Rica. Nos acompaña en la tarde de hoy el rector de la Universidad de Costa Rica, Dr. Gustavo Gutiérrez Espeleta, autoridades del Consejo Universitario, vicerrectorías, decanaturas, comunidad docente, funcionaria y estudiantil, personas invitadas especiales. Un saludo cordial a todas las personas que nos acompañan en este auditorio y quienes nos ven de forma virtual. Iniciamos con las palabras del señor rector de la Universidad de Costa Rica, doctor Gustavo Gutiérrez Espeleta.
Muy buenas tardes, tengan todos y todas. Para las personas que no tienen vínculo con la universidad, sean muy bienvenidas a esta su casa de estudios. Saludo cordialmente a la doctora Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí. Es un privilegio tenerla el día de hoy con nosotros. Representantes del Consejo Universitario, vicerrectoras, vicerrectores, autoridades universitarias, personal docente, administrativo y estudiantado de la Universidad de Costa Rica y otras universidades públicas que nos acompañan. Visitantes, señores, señoras, el pasado 8 de marzo, en la conmemoración del Día Internacional de las Mujeres, inauguramos la Unidad de Equidad e Igualdad de Género, una deuda de la universidad con la comunidad universitaria y con el país, debido al impacto social que ésta significa. Dicha instancia se encargará de llevar a cabo estrategias para avanzar en el tema de género y casualmente esta actividad es una de ellas. Hoy contamos con la honrosa presencia de la doctora Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí, una voz de autoridad a nivel internacional, quien con sus estudios sobre colonialismo y decolonialidad nos introduce en el entramado tejido de la construcción de conceptos fijados y arraigados socialmente en el mundo occidental, los cuales han posicionado a las mujeres en un lugar de inferioridad en relación con los hombres. Su enfoque nos invita a reflexionar sobre cómo las categorías de género influyen en la comprensión y la representación de las identidades y las experiencias humanas. Además, subraya la importancia de cuestionar y desafiar los supuestos preexistentes y el poder para avanzar hacia una mayor igualdad y justicia social. La doctora Oyèwùmí nos conduce también a repensar las bases del feminismo, pues argumenta que el género es una imposición colonial que no existía en formas precoloniales de organización social, como en la sociedad yorubá. Con su análisis detallado de esta sociedad en Nigeria, ella muestra cómo, en dicho contexto, históricamente, el género no era una categoría significativa y más bien el estatus social se determinaba, por ejemplo, por la edad u otros factores. me detengo a reflexionar sobre esta perspectiva, la de una cultura lejana, ajena a nuestra realidad y conocimiento, pero rica en sabiduría. Pienso que estos factores, por ejemplo la edad, son comunes a otras culturas y aportan valores dignos de imitar sin que eso signifique caer en el adultocentrismo. Dentro de todo lo que conocemos y desconocemos, en nuestra naturaleza de seres humanos tenemos una sed por la búsqueda insaciable del saber y del equilibrio de la vida, objetivos que son tan difíciles de alcanzar en sociedades en las que los valores como el respeto por la integridad, dignidad y la vida de otra persona se diluyen entre las relaciones de poder, el patriarcado, el egocentrismo y la enajenación. Una conferencia como esta nos recuerda que más allá de lo que creemos que debe ser o que puede ser, está también aquello que desconocemos y que eso desconocido puede aportar valor a lo que somos. Esto repercute en lo que pensamos, lo que decimos y en cómo actuamos. Se trata de un cambio paulatino, mejor que uno abrupto e impuesto, pues ya sabemos, porque la historia da cuenta de ello, que la fuerza no resulta ser una buena estrategia. Escuchar avances y nuevas propuestas en la investigación sobre el tema de género nos permite, como universidad, reflexionar acerca de las brechas y desigualdades con una visión amplia y necesaria, basada en el respeto y capaz de abrir puertas para ese cambio de pensamiento que nos lleve, repito, a una transformación en nuestras palabras y como efecto resulte en un accionar diferente. Esta es la generación del cambio de mentalidad, esa que se encarga de cuestionar, de deconstruir. Quizá la próxima, la que aún alcancemos a ver, será la que con sus palabras y sus acciones evidencie que nuestra labor ha dado buen fruto. Muchas personas que lucharon por los derechos que hoy disfrutamos ya no están en este mundo, pero nosotros somos la cosecha de una siembra ajena. De modo que sin perder la esperanza, sin caer por el dolor que nos produce el aprobio de quienes arrebatan sus vidas, podamos seguir avanzando en la construcción de una mejor sociedad para todas las mujeres, una en la que no tengan que caminar con temor, en la que no tengan que minimizarse frente a una amenaza sistemática de poder. Frente a la ola de violencia contra las mujeres de la cual somos testigos, la Universidad de Costa Rica tiene el deber de posicionarse en contra y de promover acciones en defensa de los derechos de todas las personas, principalmente de las más vulnerables, como las mujeres en este caso. Agradezco muchísimo la presencia de la doctora Oyèwùmí. Esta universidad le da la más cordial bienvenida y le abre las puertas con agrado. Su presencia no hubiera sido posible sin las gestiones coordinadas por Edvan Córdoba, quien ha contribuido en todo el proceso, así como el equipo de Equidad e Igualdad de Género de la Rectoría, liderado por Daniela Miranda. Les agradezco muchísimo a todas y todos ustedes por su presencia. Que tengan una feliz tarde. Muchísimas gracias.
Continuamos con la conferencia denominada La Invención de las Mujeres, 3 décadas de reflexiones y perspectivas en género, colonialismo y decolonialidad, por la profesora nigeriana Oyèrónkẹ Oyěwùmí, quien en 2021 ganó el Premio Africanista Distinguido de la Asociación de Estudios Africanos. Cada año, la Asociación de Estudios Africanos otorga el Premio Africanista Distinguido a una persona miembro de la asociación que ha realizado contribuciones extraordinarias al campo. Oyèrónkẹ es profesora titular de Sociología, con afiliaciones a estudios de género y africanos en la Universidad de Stony Brook. En su investigación académica y obra escrita, Oyèrónkẹ se centra en el género, la raza, el conocimiento, la cultura y la globalización. Su libro, La Invención de las Mujeres, dar un sentido africano a los discursos de género occidentales, de 1997, ganó el premio al libro distinguido en la sección de género y sexo de la Asociación Sociológica Americana en 1998. El monográfico también fue finalista para el premio al mejor libro de la Asociación de Estudios Africanos en el mismo año. Oyèrónkẹ es autora de 2 monografías y 4 antologías. Su segunda monografía se denomina ¿Qué género es la maternidad?, cambiando los ideales yoruba de poder, procreación e identidad en la era de la modernidad. Su último libro, publicado hace unos meses, es una antología coeditada, Nombrar africanos, sobre el valor epistémico de los nombres africanos. Oyèrónkẹ se formó en la Universidad de Ibadan, Nigeria, y en la Universidad de California de Berkeley. Ha obtenido diversas becas de investigación, incluyendo una Fulbright, becas de investigación Rockefeller y una subvención de la Fundación Ford. En 2022 fue nombrada profesora extraordinaria en el Departamento de Género y Sexualidad en la Universidad de Sudáfrica. Adelante, profesora Oyèrónkẹ.
Good afternoon, everyone. Greetings. I am honored by your invitation to share my work, and I appreciate the amount of effort that several people put into it to get me here today. This is my first time in Costa Rica. This is my first time in Central America. I do have some experience with North America, of course, and experience with South America, because I have been to Colombia, and I have been to Brazil. Indeed, many times I've been to Brazil. So I'm happy to be here. And thank you all for coming to listen to me. Let me start by stating my positionality. And to borrow some of the words of Walter Mignolo, let me articulate my locus of enunciation. I stand before you this afternoon as an African female, and my work is located in the history and experiences of Africa. But then I should immediately add that the history of Africa is global history, is everybody's history. Because an African woman gave birth to humanity. So the title of my lecture today is is the Invention of Women, 3 decades of reflections and perspectives on gender, colonialism, and decoloniality. The title derives from that of my award-winning book, The Invention of Women, Making an African Sense of Western Gender Discourses. I am told that the book is now a classic, and it continues to generate much interest in the Americas, most notably, especially after its translation into Spanish and Portuguese. The key words in the lecture title are gender, colonialism, and decoloniality. I will reflect on these concepts and their imbrications, but I must, from the outset, add another word which is not mentioned in the title, but is front, center, and back of my work. The word is race. After all, there's no gender without race. Race is maybe missing in the title, but it is always present. So is knowledge. Even more so, because of the almost total dominance of Eurocentric scholars in knowledge production. In the first part of the lecture, I'm going to start more broadly to give us an idea of how I see the world in which we find ourselves and the world from which I'm writing. So, in that first part, I talk about decoloniality and all. By the second part of the lecture, I'm going to be discussing my work on gender and then engage with the work of Judith Butler, a feminist that many of you know about. And by the last part of the lecture, one of the questions that I'm asking myself and that's being asked in a reflection such as this is that in the 30 years, at least since I've been writing, what has changed? And I'll conclude on that note. The Age of Terror was inaugurated in 1492. It had many names: the Age of Modernity, the Age of Exploration, the Age of Discovery, the Age of European colonial expansion, the Age of Columbus discovering the New World. It has all those names, but anything but its real name. For many around the globe, it was the Age of Terror, given the Native American genocides, the African Holocaust of the captive trade and slavery, the sexual slavery and daily terror of enslavement, to name a few traumatic processes. It was a period during which white supremacy was being put in place, with the Americas as the crucible of the operation of the new system. Not surprisingly then, the New Age was not described as the Age of Terror, because from the Eurocentric perspective from which we came to apprehend our current world, it was not so. But to think that it was not the Age of Terror that was inaugurated in 1492, that is a lie. We continue to live this lie. It is still a question of power. Whoever tells the stories, whoever puts the knowledge together, whoever presents the narratives, holds sway in what people believe and what we believe about ourselves. And one of my favorite quotes here from Brian Stevenson, the African-American social justice activist and law professor, who pointed out in the context of Black enslavement in the USA, and I quote, "The greatest evil of American slavery was not involuntary servitude, but rather the narrative of racial differences we created to legitimate slavery. Because we never dealt with that evil, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. It just evolved," end of quote. In 1492, and the age of violence that followed, imagine the terror that was unleashed on the Aztecs by Cortez and his ilk. Consider this passage from The Invention of the Americas, a book by Enrique Dussel, the Argentine-Mexican historian, and I quote, "But nothing compares with Pedro Alvarado's treacherous massacre of the Aztec warrior nobles. After Cortez departed from Mexico to battle Panfilio Narvaez, Alvarado invited the warriors to lay down their arms and partake of a feast. The Spaniards took up position at the exits and entrances so that none of the Aztecs could leave. The Spaniards then entered the sacred patio and commenced murdering people. They hacked into the drum player, cutting off both his arms. They then decapitated him, and his head fell to the ground at a distance. Swiftly, the Spaniards thrust their lances among the people and hacked them with their swords. In some cases, they attacked from behind, carving out entrails which spread all over the earth. They tore off heads and sliced them open, leaving bodies lifeless." End of quote. After Cortez and his group had slaughtered the nobles and taken over the Aztecs, what did they do? Indian women were compelled to act against their own will, married women against their husbands' will, young girls 10 and 15 years old. The greater and ordinary mayors and magistrates ordered them to leave their homes. These young women were conscripted to labor as far as 8 leagues away in the houses and ranches and plantations. And these mayors and people in positions of power maintained them in concubinage. End of quote. Eurocentric versions of this history claim to have brought civilization from the West to the rest. Among the package of the goodies that the West is said to have brought to the rest of the world are the rule of law, democracy, human rights, and so on. We tend to associate the rule of law with goodness itself. However, another African-American law professor, Dorothy Roberts, reminds us that, and I quote, "One of America's first laws concerned the status of children born to slave mothers and fathered through rape by white men. A 1662 Virginia statute made these children slaves. This law invariably legitimated the rape of black women, and we must remember that, and I quote, for most of American history, the crime of rape of a black woman did not exist," end of quote. So this is the age of terror that was unleashed. The terror of enslavement, Jim Crow, and lynchings of black men and women. The late great feminist scholar Bell Hooks wrote about what she called whiteness in the black imagination, and I quote, "Black folks associated whiteness with the terrible, the terrifying, the terrorizing. White people are regarded as terrorists," end of quote. The next section, I'll talk about decolonial perspectives. But post-1992, this was 500-year anniversary of Columbus getting lost in the Caribbean. We are told that a group of scholars, that there was quite a lot of ferment among scholars in this hemisphere, in Latin America, around that 500-year anniversary. And it was at that point that what became known as the decolonial perspective emerged. And the decolonial perspective emerged out of thinking about what meaning we should make of 1492, 500 years later. They dwelt on how one should understand the Eurocentric myths about modernity that followed, and some of the work they did I want to believe, led to the better understanding of the imbrication and entwinement of coloniality and modernity, thus the emergence of what is called a decolonial perspective, which holds Europe accountable for genocide, enslavement, slavery, and general dehumanization of non-whites. Coloniality, as one scholar put it, coloniality and modernity as mutually dependent phenomena, co-produced at a moment of Western history linked to the Atlantic commercial circuit and the transformation of capitalism into a global phenomenon, with Europe as the center. What enabled such brutality and dehumanization is the coloniality of power, the creation of hierarchies centered on a new category called race. According to the late Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, these hierarchies are the consequence of a process that started 5 centuries ago, which Quijano called the coloniality of power, a process that is constitutive of modernity. The period inaugurated a global system that heralded a new model of power. It was a Euro-centered capitalism in which the fundamental axis and model of power are the social classification of the world's population around the idea of race, a mental construct that was naturalized and biologized. Innate racial superiority was put forward as the explanation for why Europeans dominated other groups, of why they displaced earlier forms of dominance. The second process that Quijano highlighted was what he called the new structure of the control of labor. This new structure was an articulation of all historically known previous structures of the control of labor, slavery, serfdom, small independent commodity production, and reciprocity together around and upon the basis of capital for the world market. Quijano wrote, and I quote, "In constituting this social classification, coloniality permeates all aspects of social existence and gives rise to new and new cultural identities. Europe was mythologically understood to predate this pattern of power as a world capitalist center that colonized the rest of the world." Quijano was very clear and very great on the question of race as a colonial category, but he didn't seem to understand much about gender. And Maria Lugones, after reading my work and the work of a Native American scholar, was able to chide Quijano and point out that gender was implicated and that gender systems were set apart from being a means of production was also a means of labor exploitation and control and entwined with race. Gender and race are part of the matrix of domination that constituted the coloniality of power and colonial modernity. A full understanding of the coloniality of power cannot be realized without attention to gender. Thus, race is a colonial category, and in my own work, which I will subsequently talk about, I show that in the society I studied in West Africa and across much of Africa, gender also is a colonial category. Thus, gender justice and racial justice are not separable. And gender injustice and racial injustice were foundation of white supremacy and coloniality that permeates our contemporary world. For sociologist Ramon Grossfogel, elaborating on Fanon, the population of the earth came to be divided by the line of the human and the line of the non-human. Grossvogel elaborates Fanonian idea that there was a dividing line between those who are regarded as human and those who are subhuman. The human belongs in the zone of being and the non-human in the zone of non-being. Is it any wonder that in the 21st century we're still fighting and articulating the fact that Black Lives Matter? Lately, I found myself thinking about this whole issue of zone of being and non-being, the human, those who are human and those who are not, when I see what is happening in Gaza. The Palestinians at this point definitely seem to have been consigned to a veritable zone of non-being. I think of the Palestinian child at this moment as the poster child of the zone of non-being. In the African experience of the coloniality of power, there were two phases of European colonization. The first phase of incorporating Africans into the global capitalist system started even before 1492 with the trade in African captives. As the great Caribbean historian Eric Williams puts it, Negroes were stolen to work land that was stolen from the Indians. The second phase of Africa's incorporation into the global capitalist system came in 1884 at the Berlin Conference, where Africa was balkanized and shared like a cake among various European countries. They then physically occupied the continent, and we know what followed. In Africa, during this period, we can immediately talk of at least two genocides: the genocide in Namibia and the genocide in the Congo. In fact, the Namibian genocide is known as the first genocide of the 20th century. The narrative that accompanied Euro-American domination is the rise of the West narrative. Parallel to this rise of the West glorifies the colonial imposition of Europe on the rest of the world. Parallel to this rise of the West narrative is one that I will call the degradation of African narrative, which is on the opposite end. And it is what Chimamanda Adichie called the single story of Africa. That's why the fact that the elaboration of the coloniality of power was in the crucible of modernity, the Americas, my interest in the coloniality of power as an African scholar is to highlight the importance of what went on in the Americas to the fate and well-being of Africans on the continent. All too often, the modern history of Africans and the history of modernity from an African vantage point is recounted as if it started at the Berlin Conference of 1884. I engage with the coloniality of power in an attempt to give historical depth to the Africa's multi-layered experience of European colonial domination and its consequences. It should be understood that by the time Europe reemerged on the African shores in the 19th century, Europeans had already benefited from the largesse that African enslavement had enabled. Most importantly, by the 19th century, Europeans understood themselves to be a different species of humans than the rest. But their self-perception was also different from what they had been a few centuries earlier, because they had then been transformed by the experiences of African enslavement, the conquest of the Americas, and the racial gender system of modernity that had been put in place. They had become Europeans and Eurocentric, which, among other things, is an epistemological idea. The European of the Berlin Conference was already post-colonial. And I use post-colonial deliberately here as having passed through colonialism, having benefited from it. Consequently, the idea of late colonialism associated with the 19th century colonization of the continent of Africa, late in relation to the colonization of the Americas, South Asia, and East Asia, is a misnomer. It gives the impression that the global process of colonization are several processes, and most significantly, suggest Africa's isolation from global capitalism, to which she had dearly contributed from the very beginning. Recall that when Columbus washed up in Hispaniola in 1492, he had a number of Africans among his crew. I am also saying that the ways in which enslaved Africans were treated in the Americas constituted part of our history on the continent because it produced a fattened Europe that was eager, ready, and resourced to exploit and harvest from a degraded African identity. White supremacy is the current context in which we study, we live, and we meet, and this is the context in which I wrote my book and did my work. So for the rest of the lecture, I will discuss colonialism, feminism, decoloniality, and their imbrications. Let me talk about the invention of women, which I see that it's a book that quite a number of people are enamored of, they use in their classes, and I'm gratified that it has been translated into both Spanish and Portuguese. The book Invention was published in 1997, 10 years after I first conceived of the project. An extended sociological disquisition on gender, Invention argues that the narrative of gendered corporeality that dominates Western interpretation of the social world is a cultural discourse and cannot be taken for granted in another cultural milieu. The book offers a historical account of the construction of social categories like gender, both in Western culture and in Yoruba society of southwestern Nigeria. Drawing evidence from family organization, language, the division of labor, religion, and oral traditions, I show that unlike in the West, unlike in the Occident, as you say here, right? Unlike in the West, gender was not originally part of the Yoruba conceptual framework for making sense of the social world. The finding that historically there were no gendered names, no gendered pronouns, no gender-specific kinship categories or gender-exclusive institutions in Yoruba communities brought to light the existence of a different episteme. My work exposed gender as a colonial category, calling into question the Eurocentric idea that gender categories are natural, universal, and inherent in the way in which human communities organize and thought about themselves. My research caused a paradigm shift in the academic study of gender. As one reader eloquently puts it, and I quote, "Perhaps the powerful thing Invention did was force many of us to grapple with the fact that if gender is a construct, then it follows that there are times and spaces in which it wasn't constructed at all. 25 years later, this idea remains revolutionary. Invention has inspired generations of academics and non-academics alike to take seriously the insights of African languages, cultures, and cosmologies for understanding our broader world." End of quote. I could say more about the book, but during the Q&A, if people want to hear about how I came about writing that book, I would be happy to. But right now, let me go to the next section. Over time, in the process of writing Invention, I came to understand that we live in a white supremacist world, born of 500 years of coloniality. Thus, the global context for research and the production of academic knowledge is one in which concepts, theories, and concerns are determined, or maybe I should say over-determined by European and American experiences. Consequently, the unequal power dynamics between Africa as one region of the world and Europe and America as another continue to shape our world, even as a huge factor that is always at play, even as we resist and talk about decolonize. Despite the fact that many African societies, historically, there was no such category woman, that is, a category that is always already subordinated and exploited by a category man. African females became the representatives of women's subordination and degradation. This was the story that was being told by white women, nay, feminists, who told themselves and depicted African women as the most exploited and oppressed women in the world. And white women, white feminists saw African women as their burden, and they saw themselves as the savior of African women. Feminist scholarship on Africa was a weapon of gender violence, another plank in the horrific depictions of Africa. Writings from the global north about African women did not provide any radical departures from age-old discourse of degrading Africans. The images of African women painted by this scholarship reduced them to a sorry state. White women did not escape the racism and ethnocentrism that have characterized Western writings on Africa generally. They occupied their imperial role comfortably. In one of my earliest academic papers on the subject, I believe I wrote this in 1987. Allow me to quote myself. Western feminists did not explain their privileged status in terms of their race and the internationalization of a Western-originated capitalist system. They took for granted that it was a result of how far they had progressed as women in their own society. What white women did not realize was that if they were motivated by women's subordination in their own societies to study other women, it was their economic and racial dominance in the global system that made it possible, not their gender. In the next section, I want to reflect on what I call the weaponization of gender against African women and Black women in the diaspora. I do this by engaging with the ideas of Judith Butler, an iconic feminist, the renowned feminist philosopher and theorist. She just published a new book titled, "Who is Afraid of Gender?" Butler posed that question because serious opposition against the concept of gender has developed in a number of conservative institutions, such as the Catholic and evangelical churches. Butler writes about what Butler calls anti-gender ideological movements, and that these movements are upset at what they perceive as the enormous power of gender to wreak havoc on the family, destroy traditional values, threaten masculinity and femininity, destroy society, and even civilization itself. Pope Francis, in fact, said that gender will take down civilization. Butler's question, Who is Afraid of Gender is directed at the conservative, religious, and secular forces who are infected by what appears to be deep gender anxiety. Butler writes about Pope Francis, stating that, and I quote, that the church believes that gender fluidity and transition surgery, as well as surrogacy, amount to affronts to human dignity. The sex a person is assigned at birth, the document argued, was an irrevocable gift from God, and any sex change intervention, as a rule, risks threatening the unique dignity the person has received from the moment of conception. End of quote of what the Pope was saying. People who desire a personal self-determination as gender theory prescribes risk succumbing to the old age temptation to make oneself God. All this to show how important the concept of gender has become, especially at this moment. I ask the question, but is it only conservative forces that have advanced critiques of gender? Butler also pointed out how gender has been declared a colonial imposition by no less than Pope Francis himself. That sounds so Trumpian. How can the Catholic Church accuse people of being colonial? In that vein, the church seems to have appropriated some of the long-standing anti-colonial critique of gender, such as the one I advanced in my book. I almost want to accuse the Pope of plagiarizing. And critiques propagated by a host of scholars and movements from the global South. However, Butler appears to underestimate the significance of the post-colonial critique, because at points in the first time I had her lecture, at points she seems to conflate the anti-gender critique of the Pope with Oyèwùmí's anti-gender critique. And I am no friend of the Pope. It is Butler's bundling of the conservative critique and the more progressive opposition to gender by post-colonial subject that led me to pose the question. Butler had said, who is afraid of gender? And my own retort is, who is not afraid of gender? Butler labels the concerns of the anti-gender ideological movement a phantasm, pathologic, overwrought, and an imaginary preoccupation. Butler is surprised at this conservative move and asks, why should anyone be afraid of gender? That's a quote. And I continue her quote. In the United States, at least, the term has, until recent times, been considered relatively ordinary, end of quote. And I say, really? One wonders which US Butler had been living in when one considers the experience of African American women. And I remember the bell hooks quote again, black folks associated whiteness with the terrible, the terrifying. There was the everyday terror of sexual assaults that captive black women endured in plantation USA, and even the terror of scientific experimentation of the likes of Dr. Marion Sims, who is called the father of gynecology. Sims performed genital and gynecological surgeries on enslaved women without the benefit of anesthesia. And he did this because he believed, and so many still believe, that African and black women do not experience pain. In her book, Killing the Black Body, Dorothy Roberts draws our attention to the torment and the torture to which enslaved black women were subjected. And I quote, plantation owners were happy to turn over their slaves to Sims for experimentation. Between 1846 and 1849, Sims experimented surgically on as many as 11 enslaved women at the same time. Anacha is believed to have undergone more than 30 operations, together with 2 other enslaved women, Betsy and Lucy. They endured repeated experiments at Sim's hands all the years in the backyard hospital. Sim subscribed to the commonly held belief that Africans had special tolerance for pain. He never anesthetized his black patients. The white women who came to him later, after the surgery was an accepted form of treatment, were unable to withstand the same operation without anesthesia. Sims noted. End of quote. This should remove any doubts about why we must be scared of gender. On the African side, we must not forget the odyssey of Sarah Batman, the so-called Hottentot Venus, which even predated that. In my own writing and research on African women, that writing is one long catalog about why gender is frightening. Positioned as African women in a Western-dominated world, we are and must be afraid of gender. We are in no way considered on par with white women. If anything, the racialized system empowers them to dominate in the name of being the standard for the category woman, and they position themselves as saviors. Saviors of African women and other women around the world. I can't help but poke a jab here. After the Dobbs decision in the US, the Dobbs decision is the decision that overturned women's rights to abortion in the US, which is a very devastating happening. When I first heard it, one of the first things I said is that instead of American women, US women saving themselves, they said they were going to Africa to save Africans, whereas they hadn't put their own house in order. In a chapter explicitly naming the impact of colonization on various institutions and practices in Yoruba society, I detailed the effect and effect of the imposition of the patriarchal colonial state. I lamented what I call the wages of colonization. More significantly, I exposed how women could no longer claim the value of their labor as it was denigrated and regarded as less than what men did. So the weaponization of gender by European and American colonizers around the world was no fantasy. Their impact has been devastating for all living things, including humans around the world. Africans, many peoples, and communities of the global South, indigenous persons for centuries, have been terrorized with Western ideas and practices about gender, a colonial category that was imposed. The fears that the Catholic fathers and other conservative forces express about gender today may seem far-fetched, but historically, the imposition of Western racial gender norms and institutions worldwide has had that effect of destroying families and societies. Thus, indigenous people have lived under the fear due to imposition, colonization, distortion, and erasure. It is this age-old fear emanating from genocides and land dispossession, an attendant global inequality under the hegemony of white supremacy to which I draw attention. Perhaps the church fathers remember their own colonial strategies that they used to devastate non-Western societies. And at this point, I couldn't but remember or forget that the first ship that took captives, West African captives to England, was named Jesus. It was called the good ship called Jesus. In fact, the subject of my decades-long critique of the concept of gender is about the frightful and calamitous negative impact it has had. To critique gender as a concept, as theory, and as practice is to critique feminism, because feminists are one of the most gender-focused constituencies, spreading the racial and gender tenets of white supremacy and male supremacy around the world. They are entwined. The world we live in, a white supremacist capitalist space, is hierarchical, patriarchal, racial and gender system in which white males are at the very top, followed by white women. Sylvia Tamale, the Ugandan law professor, sums this up so very well in regard to Africa when she wrote, and I quote, "Gender as a mechanism of colonial domination over non-white racialized bodies. It was at that historical moment when the West subjugated Africa, introducing its specific sex-gender system, that the everyday lives of Africans were transformed, their bodies and subjectivities were at once placed under a new governing mechanism. The new gender regime controlled bodies, sexualities, and subjectivities, and through institutions such as education and religion, it was internalized by Africans and those that it privileges." End of quote. This is the very last part. 27 years after the writing of Invention, what is different? Has systematic racism and systematic sexism against African women, most especially, disappeared? Do African women have less to fear from a global racial gender system? Unfortunately not. The derogation and marginalization of African women have only deepened. In international settings, Africans are discounted, our experiences are erased, and the continent is often left uncounted. And I have to remember at this point that one of the most gratifying things that's happened this year is when South Africa went to the International Court of Justice to ask us as a global community to examine what was going on in Israel. I'm glad they were able to do that, and it was taken seriously. But that doesn't happen often. That is the story of Africans 3 decades later. Consider the experiences of Vanessa Nakate, a young Ugandan climate activist. Her story literally and metaphorically epitomizes the space in which we find ourselves as Africans and as African females. Let me quote this at some length. Nakate first came into public attention at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, in 2020, when the AP, the Associated Press, published a photo of the delegates as part of the coverage of the event. Nakate, the only non-white delegate, was cropped out of the pictures. In her book titled A Bigger Picture, The Fight to Bring a New African Voice to the Climate Crisis, Vanessa chronicles her reaction when she discovered her erasure from the picture. She writes, "I couldn't believe what I was seeing or not seeing. Within a minute, I came upon a link to an article that featured one of the photos that had been taken of us climate justice activists. My heart nearly stopped. It was clearly the picture I'd been in, since you could make out the edge of my coat on the far left of the frame, but I was nowhere to be seen. I'd been cropped out. I cycled rapidly through my feelings. I was frustrated, angry, and embarrassed. As I looked at the image, it became impossible to ignore that of the 5 women who had posed for that photo, I was the only one who wasn't from Europe and the only one who was black. They hadn't just cropped me out, I realized. They'd cropped out a continent." End of quote. Nakate's painful experience of one-on-one racism is unfortunately not unusual, and she understood the breadth and depth of it when she eloquently summed it up as the exclusion and erasure of the African continent. This is not new. We live in a white supremacist world in which racism is deepening. Anti-African, racist, sexist conduct and practices have been baked into international organizations, conventional histories, and institutions. Anti-African practices are a way of life in the global system. Why then should we not be afraid of the biologic that reduces humans to their bodies and the other, especially as we found, is a body? But what sort of body is the African? I'm close to the end. Earlier, I discussed Dr. Sims and his experimentation on African women and the way in which he understood them, I guess, to be unnatural if they don't feel pain. Sims performed those surgical operations. Commenting on the ignoble career of the notorious gynecologist, Angela Davis, the renowned Black activist, noted that Black women's bodies were treated as anomalies. Unfortunately, the dehumanization and the denaturalization of Black women's bodies is alive and well in the 21st century. Young African women are definitely feeling the brunt of the white supremacist global system in deeply personal ways. At the 2020 Olympics, gender and globalization have collided over the bodies of African women. I'm talking about the banning of 2 Namibian women, teenagers in fact, from particular track events at the Tokyo Olympics for no reason other than they do not fit into Western notions of the appropriate female body. Christine Mboma and Beatrice Masilingi were both 18 and were relatively unknown in international athletics until that year when they started running fast times. That caught the attention of world athletics. They were found to have what they called unnatural testosterone levels that are higher than a limit set by the sport for female athletes, prompting an immediate ban under the regulation. Imagine the terror of an 18-year-old who hasn't even ever left her country. Nobody ever told her she's not a woman or a girl. And they said, no, you have this thing. What is this testosterone? And who measures it and tells us what the meaning is? But the Namibians were not the first African women Olympians to be subjected to demeaning and degrading treatments in the name of having bodies that did not conform to the norms of the white supremacist gender system. Caster Semenya, the South African track star, is the poster child of this kind of terrible treatment. Her story illustrates very clearly the perils and scariness of the gender or regime under which we are held. And I've said this before, and I want to hope it will never haunt me, but I actually believe, and I don't know whether anybody will do the experiment. I said if people went on the African continent and took our blood as African women, they'll find out that most of us have the wrong testosterone level. It seems as if we have a continent of women in drag. That's what, you know? African women's testosterone level doesn't conform to what? The one in Manhattan or in Austria? What is it? Why is it that these young persons who have grown up in African families and spaces without ever being treated as abnormal suddenly become stigmatized as soon as they encounter Western institutions? Who speaks for them? Where's the solidarity from the global sisterhood? The Olympics are emblematic of Western space. Hence, African women suffer without recourse. It is a great metaphor for the state of globalization and the terrible terms under which Africans find themselves. One of the most important points I made about Western social categories is that such categories exemplified by gender are based on the body. People are reduced to their bodies, and therefore they derive from a certain understanding of biology. Thus, I avert that the social logic of the West is actually a biology. The cultural logic. I mean, if we think of Caster Semenya, how is it that she lived in her community without much ado until she started performing in global athletics? Sylvia Tamale wrote about the Caster Semenya phenomenon. And I quote here, Caster found herself at the intersection of genderphobia, homophobia, racism, and classism. Things would have been very different had such knowledge been situated within the cosmologies of our indigenous African people that are more encompassing and tolerant of non-binary ways of being. End of quote. Perhaps I should, please allow me to end with some interesting studies that have been done on even the genealogy of the category gender, where it emanated from. And one of the persons that has done fantastic work on this is the sociologist, the South African-American sociologist Zini Magubane. In her studies of how the category intersex emerged in Western medical discourse, exposed its imbrication with race and gender. She wrote, an ambiguously gendered white body needed to be corrected to retain its whiteness, whereas an ambiguously gendered black body was seen as confirming the essential biological difference between whites and blacks. So from the very inception, black bodies were not treated, they were not normal. And I don't know when they will become normal. It shouldn't surprise us. Equally important, Magubane wrote, was the need to use surgical correction to further cure the gender distribution of racially exclusive social privileges, such as the right to inherit and own property. So the interest in making sure somebody is this gender or that gender, like so many things in the capitalist system, is tied to property. It is tied to property. Who can own property, who can inherit property, and at the time when women couldn't inherit property, imagine what trans anything did to the system. That is where a lot of this is coming from. But what I find interesting in terms of our education and scholarship is that we pick up this concept in Nigeria, in Gambia, and just write as if these were innocuous concepts. These are things that came from particular histories. Their whole concept of gender is tied to property. Who inherits, who doesn't? And now, I even have a deeper understanding of some of the things I wrote in Invention that I didn't even understand the ramifications. Because when they ask me, but what about Yoruba inheritance system? Can women inherit? I said, of course. Our inheritance system is about collectivity. It wasn't about property. And yet we're comparing apples and oranges. Let me conclude. Judith Butler, I think in her latest book, now appreciate more than ever the need for collaboration, the need for allyship, the need for people to work together, the need for alliances. And she said, if we're to overcome anti-gender ideological construct, and she says, it makes no sense for gender-critical feminists to ally themselves with reactionary powers in targeting trans, non-binary, genderqueer people. Despite our differences, we have to create a struggle across differences that keeps the source of oppression in focus. A nice thought, but how possible it is it? Let me end with this last thought, and this is on decolonial feminism. A couple of months ago, I was part of a panel on the decolonial, and somebody, in addressing me, called me a decolonial feminist, and I immediately rejected it. I reject the term decolonial feminist, not because I don't appreciate what the concept of decolonial brings to the table and the need to decolonize. After all, the invention of women was about decolonization and the need to decolonize, even before people started using the term decolonial. However, today I find that the trend, the preoccupation with the word decolonize and decolonial has its limitations. I have misgivings about it, especially as an African. I'm not saying we shouldn't decolonize, but when we reduce everything to decolonize, what it says about us is that we are reacting. We're reacting to the colonizer. And I feel that whenever the word colonize comes up, whether it's decolonize, post-colonial, whatever, we reinscribe the colonizer. We reinscribe whiteness at the center. That may be okay in certain places. I don't see how it describes or explains anything about Africa. Colonization cannot be the starting point of anything and everything. Africans have been there forever, before the white man even became white, okay? So why should we start with that? And so I asked the question, and I'll end with my question. If you call me a decolonial feminist, where do I put Yeye Osun? Osun is an important Orisha in my Yoruba tradition, one of the founders of humanity. So why should I start with decolonial when we have been here forever? Remember, it was an African woman who gave birth to humanity. And as I like to say, we invented humanity and we invented God, because there's no, wherever you have humanity, you have God. Thanks for listening. It's been long, but you wanted me to explain all those concepts. Thank you. Yes, yes. Okay. Yes. And I'll just get my water. Yes.
Un fuerte aplauso de nuevo para la profesora Oyèrónkẹ. Le agradecemos por su conferencia esta tarde. A continuación se abrirá el micrófono para las preguntas del público. Agradecemos sean preguntas puntuales y breves para la profesora Oyèrónkẹ. Los y las compañeras del programa de voluntariado estarán llevando el micrófono, así que si alguien tiene alguna pregunta puede levantar la mano y con gusto procederemos. Acá adelante hay una Mano levantada.
Perfect. Thank you. Yes.
Um,
Do you need that? Oh, no.
okay, so first of all, I want to say that I'm a huge fan of your work, and I want to thank you for being a voice for all those women that were forget by the Western feminism and the white feminism. You are such a person to admire.
Speak in Spanish.
Yeah, she's speaking in English. So if you want,
Oh,
or
okay.
you can.
Oh, I take it off. Okay. Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so as I say, I'm a huge fan of your work, and I want to thank you for being a voice for all those women that were forget by the Western feminism and the white feminism. You are such a person to admire. And second of all, well, and when you were writing the book, doing some of the research for some topics and specific information for the book, do you encounter some limitations finding certain information? Like, do you encounter some limitations finding some information or finding correct information?
Yes, I think that's a very good question and an important question, because one of the things that people ask me, and it's not only here, people have asked me such questions, even in Nigeria. People have asked me such questions even amongst Yoruba people, that the information. And I always say this: all the information in the invention of women, all the information are current. They are here now. They are not archaeological. So what is interesting and puzzling is that even in Yoruba land, where these things are in front of people, they can't see it. It seems as if a wool has been pulled over people's eyes. And let me give you an example that is a recurring example that will really put this plainly in perspective. I have had encounters again and again with Yoruba-speaking people, male and female, even people who speak better Yoruba than I do. And so when I start talking about my work, and I say that, well, you know that in Yoruba, we have no word for brother, we have no word for sister, we have no word for son, we have no word for daughter. They look at me and as if they want to fight me. And they said, what do you mean? And I said, think about it. And they think in 1 minute and they say, oh my God, you are right. So what's going on? What is going on? And this is despite the fact that that morning when they woke up, right, they may have said to their younger sibling, go iron my shirt, bring me my cup. People are not thinking of it. And so the information in invention is that kind of information, things that are right in front of you, things that are right under your nose, and you don't see it. Let me give you a quick example of one that it's quite interesting. Lately in the US, at least since I've been in the US, I've heard people say that the tradition of the cowboy actually came from Black Americans. But when you watch Westerns, you don't know that. But only lately, there's more information. And then people say, oh my, that's why they were called boys. We all said cowboy. Who calls grown white men boys? I hope that answers the question.
Well, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and your lecture has been amazing. I wonder, what advice or lessons do you consider essential to be in the context of Latin America to continue to flourish, the movement of the feminism specifically, and to young activists?
I almost want to say I don't know, but I'm not an activist as such, but I'll give credit to people who are out there who are struggling and all that. But I would immediately say that the state of the world we're in now goes beyond Black Lives Matter, feminism. Everywhere you look, we're in trouble. Things are difficult. And so I think that it's the whole issue of alliances, how people can work together across all sorts of identities, because you remember that today, even our identities are under scrutiny. So I think that at this moment more than ever, how people can work together wherever they are, wherever they are standing, is very important. There's one here.
Buenas tardes. Un cordial saludo.
Okay. Okay. Yes. Yes. Great. Mm-hmm.
Un momento más, por favor. Ok, un saludo, primero por parte de la Universidad Nacional de Costa Rica. Nuestra pregunta sería, ¿qué pasos deberían tomar las comunidades académicas y las sociedades africanas para reconstruir las identidades de género y las estructuras sociales que han sido alteradas por la colonización?
Did I hear you say universities? Oh, okay. 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 So what I hear in your question is that you are arrogating a lot. You are arrogating a lot to the university as an institution. Yet in more ways than one, universities have been very problematic too. But we also understand and know the resources invested in universities, right? And we must make good of those resources. And after all, I'm here today sharing my ideas with you in a university, which is a great thing, right? So universities can be a forum for that. But most importantly, universities should not see themselves as the only institution of knowledge. In fact, I think what should go on within universities, apart from the million and one other things that go on in a university, is to show that there are different forms of knowledge, and we must go outside of the university to make sure that we take those forms of knowledge seriously, especially knowledge amongst the people. And I cannot but talk about the knowledge that inheres in women as mothers. There are special kinds of knowledge there that are outside of the university. So I think first and foremost, the university should not privilege itself as the only place where knowledge comes from. The university should be open to communities. And I think part of your question also said that how can we restore the things that have been lost? I don't think we can think in those terms, or that we can't think merely in those terms, whether on gender, whether on race. I always say the question we must ask ourselves at this moment is, what kinds of societies do we want? I think that's the question. And then how do we get it? That's how I see the beginnings of a process of moving forward and acknowledging the humanity of everybody. And of course, beyond the humanity of everybody, we must acknowledge other living things because we are killing ourselves and the planet. So it's a big job. Thank you.
Nice to meet you here. Feels very honored to meet your work. And I have a couple of questions for you. How is the identity of Black African women being shaped and affected by the current imposition of Western ideas and standards? And the other one, you previously mentioned that there is no concept of gender in certain African societies.
Can you move forward, maybe?
How is the identity of Black African women being shaped and affected by the current imposition of Western ideas and standards? And the other one, you mentioned that there is no concept on gender in certain African societies. However, you also discuss various ways women are categorized based on different stages of their lives. Could you please elaborate more about this point and explain these categorizations in detail, please?
Thank you, but I couldn't catch it, much of it. Can you? Can somebody beg something? Okay.
Si puedes volver a repetirla, tal vez un poquitito más despacio y acercando el micrófono, porque como que no escuchamos por aquí muy bien. Gracias.
You mentioned that there is no concept of gender in certain African societies. However, you also discuss various ways women are categorized based on different stages of their lives. Could you please elaborate more on this point and explain these categorizations in detail?
I had categories, I had the small points, but I didn't put the whole question together. She can come here
Okay.
and talk to me.
Dice que sí, puedes venir acá al frente y hacer la pregunta. O también puede hacer la pregunta en español y si no la traducimos acá. Ah, bueno. Ok, es el eco, no es el inglés.
Thank you.
Sorry, I don't know if you got the first one. It's the second one, the problem you didn't hear well, right? Or no. Or we both. Oh, got you. How is the identity of Black African women being shaped and affected by the current imposition of Western ideas and standards? Western?
How is the position of the Black African woman being affected?
How is the identity of the African women being shaped?
Yes, of the
Yeah.
African woman,
being shaped and affected by the Western impositions ideas. And this other one is there's no concept in certain African societies, as I understand, right? However, you discussed that there are different ways women are categorized based on different stages of their lives. So I would like to know more about that.
Okay. The first one, I want to say that. Oh. The first one, if I understand this correctly, is exactly about how Africans, the African identity, African woman has been affected, and I want to say degraded, right, by the way in which Africans in general and African women have been portrayed. And it's not just portrayal, because you know that scholarship, what we write, is also what policies are made of, whether at the United Nations, whether at the World Bank, whether we want to respond when there's a conflict and so many African women are being killed, whether we're going to rise up and fight on their behalf. All these things are shaped by information. Some would say scholarship, but scholarship is not neutral. And so in the paper, one of the first papers I ever wrote, the subtitle was Images of African Women in Western Feminist Discourse. And I look at African women as the beast of burden and take the whole issue of African women do not feel pain. It has an influence today in the United States. The maternal mortality rate of black women is very high relative to any other group when they are giving birth. And in fact, I had a student at Stony Brook who was doing her PhD in sociology and a nurse before she came to study sociology, and she was looking at how pain medication is given to people, to women, when they are giving birth. A lot of times, black women are deprived of pain medication just because this idea that they don't feel as much pain is still very much there. And then in the US too, there's the idea that black people, men and women, are drug-seeking. So keep drugs away from them. So if the drug is the one to cure whatever is going on with them, those are just minor examples of huge impacts. So that's the question. Then your other question is the whole issue of in societies where gender categories were non-existent or not privileged, right? Well, in Yoruba society now, gender is very much there, but so are other categories. This category of relative age that shapes the social order, whether within the family and outside of it, is still very much there. And what is most interesting about that is that in families, for example, the children, the members of the family are ranked. There's a hierarchy, and the hierarchy is based on relative age. And we still operate in many places. I have a WhatsApp group with my siblings, and as I like to tell my students in the US, I used to say that frighten them in the US. I have 26 siblings. And I said, and we were not starving. So even on my WhatsApp group, we're arguing, but we're giving seniority. If somebody writes a text, and this person is the older one, the way I respond is different from if it's a younger person, you almost say, shut up, right? And we do this today on WhatsApp, right? So those categories are still there, but the gender categories too have become so important for many reasons. And one simple reason is that Western education, for example, came to men first in our society, in colonial Nigeria. Not women, but you know that today, those who will get jobs, those who will make money, are the people who have more, whatever Western modernity brought. And men have more of that. And so if your younger brother, even if he's 20 years younger than you, is the one who has money today, and is the one who sends you money for food, I think the way you talk to him is going to be different. So those are the ways in which gender has been institutionalized, even in conjunction with other social categories. I hope that answers your question. Okay, well, they could have more if they want. No, but I'm fine.
First of all,
There's one guy there. Okay.
I wanted to say thank you for being here. Thank you for setting aside the time to share your work and your experience with us. In your autobiography, it mentions that you recently or at one point participated in a Fulbright grant. And as I'm currently in Costa Rica on a Fulbright grant, I wanted to ask you...
That I'm interested in what?
No. I'm currently in Costa Rica on a Fulbright grant, and as your biography mentioned that you also had a Fulbright grant at one point, I wanted to ask you where and when that experience took place, how you felt that experience went for you, and what has that experience contributed to your current work?
I don't know which particular experience you are referring to.
Your Fulbright grant.
Oh, my Fulbright.
Yes.
So my experience of Fulbright.
Correct.
Anything specifically or just in general?
What Fulbright grant did you have? Where did it take place? When? And what has that contributed to your current work?
What did it do to my work? Oh. I got a Fulbright. I hope I'm hearing the question correctly. I believe in 2014, 2015. And I went to Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. And you know, I'm from West Africa. Those things are significant. So my going to Zimbabwe for a Fulbright opened my eyes so much more to our continent, the continent of Africa. Because interestingly enough, and many people don't know this, the experiences of colonization on the continent has variations. For one thing, some of the ideas I discussed about colonization, the actual colonization of Africa, applies to West Africans and East Africans, but not necessarily to South Africa. Because when we talk about the Berlin Conference of 1884, and for many Africans in the West and in the East and in North, is such a big and important date. In South Africa, not so. Because I think one big date in South Africa is 1652, at least 200 years before. So that's one example. But with Zimbabwe, one of the things that I really appreciated about going to Zimbabwe is the fact that in my research and in my learnings, I have known that we talk about two forms of colonization on the continent. There were the settler colonies, in which white people actually came and settled and lived there, which is the story of colonization worldwide. Because colonization, by definition, is a settler process in which settlers come to the country. But colonization in West Africa is not like that. We didn't have white people coming to live in the country. The only white people who were in West Africa were the administrators, and they were very few. So our type of colonization was a non-settler colonization, which produces a totally different experience, especially on the land question, whether it's in Zimbabwe or South Africa, or even in the Americas. The first inkling that you know that somebody has taken you over is that they took your land. In West Africa, it wasn't like that. Colonization was different. So that was one appreciation, deep appreciation, that my time in Zimbabwe brought to me. Thank you. He was going to say something. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, we're gonna go.
No problem.
Do you want?
Okay.
Muchas gracias por sus consultas a la profesora Oyèrónkẹ. A continuación, y para finalizar, vamos a proceder a la rifa del libro que fue anunciada en la convocatoria de esta conferencia. El libro que tenemos por acá de la profesora se llama La Invención de las Mujeres, una perspectiva africana sobre los discursos occidentales del género. Vamos a consultarle a la profesora que nos indique una letra y un número que están acomodados en bloques según el auditorio, y de ahí vamos a ver pues quién obtiene este libro. Entonces voy a explicarle un momentito a la profesora la dinámica de la letra y el número y ya regreso.
You said to 17, right?
Yeah, to 17.
I said 16. Yes.
16.
N16.
Ok, ya tenemos la letra y el número. La profesora Oyèwùmí dijo la N 16. El número está debajo del asiento, sí. La letra está a un costadito de la fila. Está vacía. Está ok.
There's empty. There's no one in that seat. Okay. Within those parameters.
Yeah, okay. It's because that there.
She found it. Oh yes, I'll be happy to.
Okay.
And if people have a book and they want me to sign out.
Okay. Muchas gracias. Te vamos a entregar el libro en este momento, pero la profesora va a firmarlo al finalizar.
Yes, I'll be happy to sign books. Yes.
Ok, pero vamos a esperar un momentito, ya vamos a terminar y procedemos a eso. Ahorita nada más vamos a finalizar la conferencia. Gracias. Y bueno, hemos concluido esta actividad. Agradecemos la presencia de todas las personas que nos acompañaron, tanto las personas que se conectaron de manera virtual, así como las personas acá presentes. Les recordamos salir por la misma puerta en la que ingresaron. Está la puerta A y la puerta B, esto para poder hacer entrega de los aparatos de traducción simultánea. Y sin más, le damos de nuevo un fuerte aplauso a la profesora Oyèwùmí por su maravillosa conferencia. Muchas gracias y buenas tardes.